Welcome to the UO Today podcast, conversations that offer a glimpse into the heart of the humanities at the University of Oregon. Listen as our faculty, students, and guests introduce ideas and research that help us reflect on the past, navigate the present, and imagine possible futures. I'm Leah Middlebrook, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Colin Williamson, Assistant Professor of Cinema Studies at the University of Oregon. Professor Williamson is a historian of animation, special effects, and non-theatrical film. He specializes in early cinema's place in international histories of art, science, and technology. Colin Williamson is the author of Hidden in Plain Sight, An Archaeology of Magic and the Cinema, a book that came out with Rutgers University Press in 2015, and Drawn to Nature, American Animation in the Age of Science, which came out with the University of Minnesota Press in 2025. He is associate editor at Animation, an interdisciplinary journal, and he joined the UO faculty in the fall of 2023. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Colin.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Tell us a little bit about your background.
Oh, how far back should we go? I'm from California originally. I went to an undergraduate program in cinema studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and have followed that all the way through. I fell in love with film history very early on, and then tried to do some production work afterward, but really missed, reading and writing. And then navigated that toward, an academic job in film history. But the background primarily is a training in early cinema studies is my primary field. I think on paper that runs from around 1890 through around 1915, but I have very expansive research areas that kind of spin out from that. So historian by training, and now happy to be here at the U of O.
What sparked your interest in cinema and its history?
Yeah, I wanted originally to be a documentary filmmaker, and I think I hold on to some of that, aspirational stuff every now and then in my own like how I approach the cinema. But um, I discovered early cinema very early on and had a very difficult time relating to it. And I remember being very intrigued by why I couldn't understand it. And that historians do a really good job of helping you relate. So I kind of fell in love with the job of writing stories about how we can understand the past. And the further I followed that, the more I became interested in that particular period as a very exciting, kind of energized period in cinema history that um, keeps on giving. So there are a lot of folks who think, in the study of early cinema that maybe we've exhausted things that we can say about it. And for me, the connection was that the more I learned about it, the more I felt like we had to say, and I kept digging and digging and digging, and I think we were not done yet. So it was that early intrigue with just not knowing what to do with these film objects that seemed so different from the ones that I grew up with in, like the 90s and early 2000s. And then wanting to be able to do something to understand that better, and now sharing it with, people who read my work and students who walk into the class. Yeah.
Tell us some about that work. Maybe let's start with your first book, Hidden in Plain Sight, An Archaeology of Magic and the Cinema.
That one, so that was the dissertation two books. So that was the first one. The book broadly is about, how do I frame this? A history of special effects in relation to the history of science. So you'll see the continuity from that book to this next one. That was trying to reimagine how special effects work in the early cinema period. So some of the dominant narratives historically in cinema studies had been that special effects are forms of kind of mass entertainment commodities that don't invite a lot of critical thinking. So they are these kind of empty spectacles. And I was really interested in thinking about them differently, because when I saw special effects, I was very interested in like, well, how they made those and how they worked, and discovered in researching them that special effects have always been these kind of objects of education. So they are ways that technicians teach people about what's possible in the cinema. The first book was a kind of history of special effects as forms of visual education, teaching audiences how the cinema works during periods of innovation. Um, and it's framed as an archaeology because I go into it's a short time span, but what we would call the deep time of media. So I go back to around the 1600s and trace how visual education and kind of spectacles evolved together and how the early cinema picked that up. So that was the trajectory of that book, and the intervention was a kind of a reframing of something that is already kind of obvious to us. Like special effects are popular and known and knowable, and the intervention was to say we should think about them differently when we dig into the archives and find out that people have always been talking about them as, opportunities for learning how they work. So a lot of the job that I hold on to as a historian is sitting in those archives and using those materials to, you know, reframe very familiar topics for folks.
You mentioned looking at special effects differently, and I wonder, do you remember some of the films, some of the early movies you saw where you thought, wait a minute, there's something really interesting happening here?
Yeah, so personal history, I remember seeing Jurassic Park in the 1990s, and that is a blockbuster special effects film. And I remember distinctly thinking that the film was inviting us to think about like how they could animate a dinosaur, and then not like really understanding how that would work in a film that doesn't seem to be very complicated at all, you know? So that was one of the earliest memories I had. And then when I started studying it, as in college, but also in graduate school, I found that early film history was full of all that stuff. So the early filmmakers were doing very similar work to Steven Spielberg, of kind of showcasing these technological innovations as opportunities that we should be curious about and to wonder about and maybe dig into as audiences to kind of understand the medium. But yeah, Jurassic Park, I think uh, it holds a pretty strong place. I teach it all the time. I teach sci-fi, and it holds up pretty well, I think. Yeah.
And then your second book, Drawn to Nature, American Animation in the Age of Science, that just came out. Congratulations.
Thank you. And thank you very much, to the Humanities Center for supporting it. I had a colleague recently tell me that it looks very fancy now because it has colored inserts. But we got those color plates in there. I'm very happy with it. I don't know how you feel about your work, but the first book I was very nervous about, and this book I sent off and I said that was something that I can be very proud of. So thank you for flagging it. It is, it kind of feels like a follow-up to the first book. I deal with the history of science in both books. The first book is about special effects, which are related to animation, but not always about animation. So this second one is me pivoting in the direction of thinking about the history of science and technology in relation to a different topic, which I'm focusing on there, has to do with the natural world. So that book traces a shorter history, mostly early to mid 20th century history of American animation in particular, and thinking specifically about what we call popular American animation, so animated cartoons that are made for mass audiences in a commercial entertainment form, and writing a story about how the cartoons that we might be familiar with from the early period with animators such as Winsor McCay, who was a very famous early animator through Walt Disney and to some post-war animators. The cartoons that they made were very deeply in conversation with the history of science, and they don't look that way. So the book does this kind of excavation of how animators were thinking about science in relation to the natural world and then using that thinking to kind of shape how they made cartoons. One very quick example I can give is that the Winsor McCay, the early American animator from the early 1900s, made these really fun squashing and stretching cartoon characters that move kind of plasmatically on the screen. And that has typically been talked about in terms of comic book culture and amusement park culture and modernization in the early 20th century of this kind of ecstatic experience of the modern world. And when I worked through the archives thinking differently about him, I found that he was very fascinated with Charles Darwin and Darwinian evolution, and that his cartoons were actually kind of visualizations of how evolution as an idea works, of like species evolving over time. Um, so then I followed that rabbit hole and found that a lot of animators had very similar interests, and that what we think about in terms of their very familiar cartoon figures have always been about like changes in like how people think about evolutionary theory. I make a gesture to genetics and heredity and eugenics in the 1920s informing popular cartoons, natural history in the 1940s, atomic science in the 1950s, and kind of finding these really interesting synergies between archives that don't typically get put together. So that's the goal of the book, is to say historians of science and historians of animation have very little to talk about, I think, in terms of disciplines and commitments, but the archives allow us to make really interesting conversations happen. And then the goal of the book is to say we can see those conversations in cartoons that seem like they have nothing to do with science at all. So that's the broad strokes of it. It opened up a lot of new ways for me to think about like how interdisciplinary work happens and what we can do with it. But you'll see too that that's the thread, the like the popular and the familiar that I'm trying to kind of defamiliarize and tell different stories through.
Everything you're saying right now is so interesting, and it's leading me to wonder how it was that you found yourself thinking to research animation and contemporary film in archives of science. I mean, what was that? How did you think to go there?
Yeah, most of it happened by chance. So that second book was actually a kind of accident, which is one of those wonderful things that happens. I had wanted to write a book about Disney, because I had always wanted to write something about Fantasia from 1940, and Fantasia has some really kind of wonderful animation special effects, and it was a very experimental film at the time. So I went to the Disney archives and started sifting through their boxes, and I found these really what were to me strange drawings that the animators had done, scientific studies of plants, and I couldn't figure out why they were studying plants in a file on Fantasia. So I dug through that really deep and found that they were working with biologists and studying plant life to visualize some of their animation innovation technologies in the 1940s. Um, and then the book was like, okay, maybe that's what I'll write about. And then I started doing the research and found that a lot more people were doing that, and fell back on Winsor McCay and then followed that all the way through. Um, and then what happened with that was I said, okay, I'm starting to see the cartoons differently, and now I have to find the archives that are going to help me explain what that looks like. So started to identify different collections in relation to those animators and studios that I typically would not have branched out into. Um, and then finding and kind of piecing them together with like studio archives to say that like maybe in the history of science they're not talking about Winsor McCay at all, but Winsor McCay is using Darwinian theory, and how if we line those two archives up, can we see the conversation playing out?
Fantastic. Tell us a little bit about the classes that you're teaching this term
Oh, this term I have, it's
or
like
this
week two,
year.
this week two, right? So it feels like I've been at it forever, but I still don't know where I am. Um,
Been there, am
yeah,
there. Yeah.
yeah. I'm teaching it was one of our core cinema studies classes. It's called Media Aesthetics. It's a majors course for film analysis. The topics class that I'm teaching is relevant to research areas. It's a science fiction class. I've taught it. This is my third rotation class that I created at the U of O. Um, it is a class on the history and theory of science fiction film as genre, and it looks specifically using it's one of my, the outcomes of research. So one of those things where I get to speak, to the things that I also write about. But looking at not what science fiction is, but what it does specifically throughout the 20th century into the contemporary moment. So thinking about genres doing work. To alleviate anxieties, to raise questions, to problem solve, and then to think through that in relation to concerns from the 20th century into the present about innovations in science and technology. So, very exciting class for me, exhausting too, given, that it is largely a class about science fiction and how humans respond anxiously to change. And I think it's a very important class for me because it is something that I care about both in teaching and research, but also increasingly is like something that students I find care about a lot. You know, we slash they are very much navigating complex like global situations, you know, and thinking through like the implications of AI, for instance, which is a sci-fi topic on their lived experiences every day and their learning experiences. So being in week two, that's what I was thinking just now. I was like, I don't know where I am because of like every sci-fi class so far, all two of them have just been like intellectually maxing me out. But that's where it
And
is presently.
probably also just so useful and helpful to your students too. So,
That's the hope, right? It is deeply a class on humanity, and the hope is that maybe we will all be better humans on the far side. Yeah.
tell us a little bit about your class, Hands-on Film History. This is a class I think you developed with the support of a Williams Instructional Fund grant.
I developed that last academic year, starting last fall, and taught it in spring 2025 was the pilot version of it. It's an advanced undergraduate seminar. On paper, it's a kind of research methods class of how you do research in the context of film history. And the idea for the course and the support from the Williams project for it was trying to find innovative ways of helping students both conduct that work in different ways, how to like get access to research methods, because that's very challenging in cinema studies when students are drawn to holding a camera to get them to understand the importance of rigorous research and writing. So part of it was to think, well, how can we innovate on that? The other part was to help students in our department bridge what we could call like a theory practice divide. So students who are interested in production and less interested in history and theory, of possibly having a class that does both of those together. So the hands-on component for the class is that I am working with them to learn research methods through the act of making things. In the pilot version was the topic we tested out was early animation history and history of special effects. And we said we're going to study that. And instead of, well, in addition to reading and writing about it, because there was a background of the traditional disciplinary stuff, we are going to learn about it by recreating things. So every week I walked in with a box of junk and I showed them something and I said, now go problem solve and figure out how to remake the technique or technology. Um, Here are all the materials. And what was really fascinating, and I think the biggest outcome for the class was that like experimental mode of just saying like you will learn how early filmmakers created this effect by figuring out how to do it yourselves. So a lot of it revolved around them problem solving in groups and running out within a 4 hour block once a week and trying to make something happen, coming back and then talking it through, and then using their successes and failures to kind of connect them to history. Because then what I would do is I would walk them through, well, here's the historical context where animators arrived at the same problems and solutions, um, and kind of worked through that making toward a deeper understanding of how to do innovative historical work. Um, it was very, I'm pleased to say it was very successful. Students reported that was one of the most impactful experiences that they had. So I'm teaching it again this spring. And the impacts, so I did an assessment for the Williams and tried to figure out like, what does it mean when you say this was a good class, right? They talked about such wonderful things that like getting hands-on experiences with making early animation techniques and technologies help them feel like kind of agency as students again, like that they
Hmm.
could own the learning process, that they felt like embodied connections to historical figures. So there were things like empathy came up, you know, as an outcome, and I was like, that's a wonderful thing. We just studied special effects, and you're talking about being an empathic human being, right? So I'm leveraging some of those outcomes to do this as an ongoing project and it's scaling out into bigger ways. So there's a website that I created that's getting some good traction in some of the international societies that I belong to. And I have two articles on the class, kind of a pre and post setup that talks about the significance of doing that kind of work here at the University of Oregon.
Oh, that sounds amazing. That sounds fantastic. What attracted you to the University of Oregon?
Oh gosh, all kinds of things. Partly chance, but originally from the West Coast, and you know how academia goes. If you bounce around enough, you start to wonder, where places are that you would like to be in terms of fit. So I think on like the most basic level, the spirit of cinema studies here is very unique, right? So they do in what we call integrated. We do they, as I was looking at it. I'm now one of them. We do what's called integrated cinema studies. So students study creative practice and history theory and analysis simultaneously, and that is increasingly rare, I think, for students to have that as a model because of the ways that higher education is becoming a lot more practical for folks, right? That it makes a lot more sense if you want to make movies to go to a training school, right? But I'm drawn to those spaces that are kind of like catching students in the in between. And trying to help them understand that, studying cinema is not just about making movies, but it's about thinking differently about the world. And there are a lot of things that you can do with it. And I really wanted to be in a place where people were committed to that. And my colleagues um, are some of the most wonderful folks that I've ever met because of that. And, it might be something about Oregon that draws them here, that drew them here, and, also drew me here. They've built a wonderful community, and I'm very happy to be a part of it now.
Well, we are very, very happy that you're amongst us. So, really, thank you for that, and then thank you also for taking the time to speak with us today.
Ah, that was nice. I appreciate you taking the interest as well.
I have been speaking with Colin Williamson, Assistant Professor of Cinema Studies at the University of Oregon. Our research notes segment helps us keep current on recent developments in University of Oregon faculty and student humanities research, such as the book we will be discussing today, The Shadow Gospel: How Anti-Liberal Demonology Possessed U.S. Religion, Media, and Politics, by Whitney Phillips and Mark Brockway. Whitney Phillips is an associate professor of information politics and media ethics and the John L. Hulteng Endowed Chair in Media Ethics and Responsibility in the School of Journalism and Communications at the University of Oregon. Whitney, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about your research focus.
My research is exhausting and it spans the intersections of religion, politics, and media in the United States. And when I say religion, that subsumes a lot of different things. It can be religious sounding words, it can be religious belief or practice. It also can be vernacular religion, so the ways that people engage in these kinds of practices outside of a institutional church setting. And that shows up in my research, my historical research for this book, but it also comes up a lot in a class I teach in the School of Journalism and Communication, Cross-Cultural Monster Narratives, which looks at the ways that people sort of bring an enchantment focus to their life through vernacular religious practices. So I'm basically looking at what are people doing in the world, and that ends up intersecting in a lot of different directions. So my work covers a lot of different things, is the short answer.
Wow, it sounds fascinating. Tell us a little bit about the Shadow Gospel: How Anti-Liberal Demonology Possessed U.S. Religion, Media, and Politics.
Yeah, so the probably the best way of describing what the book is about and what it is interested in explaining, I had been having an ongoing conversation with a friend of mine at Syracuse University, which is where I was before the U of O, and we were discussing the events of January 6th, 2021. And one of the things that my friend was asking me about, he was a faculty member also at Syracuse who studies politics and religion. He was remarking on the signs that many of the rioters were carrying that had religious messages or religious sounding messages, but that was also distributed amongst messages that were explicitly trollish or referenced other kinds of internet memes. And I have a background studying subcultural trolling behavior online. And so he asked me, oh, well, were trolls evangelical? And that is a long conversation, but the short answer is that they were not. And the idea that religiosity would have been in any way part of the subcultural spaces I was studying, the question was almost bizarre to me. But then as we continued talking about, well, how do you then account for the sort of religious infusion of these messages alongside internet culture messages through those conversations? We realized that there was a story to tell about the fact that in the United States, our politics is overrun with religious sounding messages that are actually pretty secular, and then also a lot of secular messages, or at least secular sounding messages that are kind of religious in the sense that all of the messages, whether they sound religious or sound secular, they're pointing to what we identified as this figure of the liberal devil, which you can actually trace back to the Cold War, where you start to see all of these different characteristics, some of which had to do with politics and some of which did not, but a bunch of unrelated stuff essentially getting squished together and then collectively described as the left, or a sort of a liberal, but in this very, very amalgamated sense. And that became the figure of the liberal devil becomes the basis of how we talk about the culture wars. And so in telling the story historically, where does this figure come from? What is it actually mapping onto? How has it shaped our politics? And then how does it account for a very weird politics where the most religious sounding language is often not talking about the Bible at all? Instead, it's talking about fighting this amalgamated figure that is both everywhere and nowhere. And so it accounts for some of the difficulties, challenges that are baked into our politics at this time. But it all really stemmed from this disconnect between what we were seeing during January 6th and what actually the frameworks that exist around polarization, around the culture wars. Those traditional stories didn't quite tell the story that accounted for what we were seeing. And so the book tells the story that helps to account for what we were seeing.
That sounds so interesting. Um, what makes this topic important to humanity?
Well, I would say, and I say this smiling, but I'm not smiling. Politically, we're in a bit of a hellscape right now. And part of the reason is not just that we are polarized, although there are definitely factions that cannot abide each other in the same room. There's no question about that. But the frameworks that have been used to try to describe how we got to this moment, I think, are not correct. And so if the language that we have and if the frameworks that we have don't accurately describe the problem, then we are in an even greater deficit in being able to do something about them. And regardless of what someone's politics are right now in this moment, things are not working well. We are not functioning as a pluralistic democracy in the way that we could and should be. And that has in part to do with how do we see each other, especially when we happen to disagree with each other. And when you are dealing with something like the figure of the liberal devil, which often gets described using actual devil words, Satan words, in terms of ascribing a kind of apocalyptic threat to things that are deemed liberal, that when you have that as a guiding framework for political discourse, those conversations will go nowhere, and they will go nowhere really fast. And we are seeing those disconnects, those just the inability to even just kind of wrap our arms around what is happening. That is happening across the country right now and globally as well. But in our particular political circumstance, things are a mess. And we don't have frameworks or linguistic systems in order to talk about things in productive ways. And you cannot have a functioning democracy where that is not possible. So I think that highlighting where do the frameworks fall short, the traditional frameworks, how can we describe the problems in a way that actually gets to the heart of what's going on, that serves a very important function of maybe we could get a little bit closer to some kind of solution that allows for pluralistic participation within our democracy. So that's a big answer, but we are in a big moment right now, and things are going wrong. And we do not have the tools at this moment to solve the problems, because if we did, they would be solved already.
Oh, thank you. I think that that's a wonderful explanation. As you were talking, I was reflecting on a moment in 2015 with a family member where they said to me, well, everyone knows that Hillary Clinton is the devil. And I was so confused. I really didn't know what they were saying. And I didn't know if it was a laugh line or if it was a religiously motivated line. I didn't know what was being said at the time. So I think your book is really going to shed light on those moments where we are talking to someone we want to communicate with and we're not able to go any further. I mean, I loved the way you put it when you were talking just now.
Well, I appreciate that. And, part of the answer when somebody is using actual devil language, sometimes it's meant very sincerely, and sometimes it's a form of trolling. So there's a kind of provocation that can also complicate discussion. But when you're talking about a genuine worry that a particular figure, a high-profile Democrat, is actually satanic or is actually evil or is actually a threat to real America, if you are not a person who maintains that belief, it's really easy to just instantly feel so alienated from the conversation or so confused by what you're hearing that you don't even really know where to start. But the reality is that once you realize that this figure of the liberal devil, again, whether you use explicit devil words or not, but this sense that there is a creeping leftist influence, and it is destructive to America, to the family, to God, to conservatives. That when you understand that that structuring framework goes back 80 years and is central to the emergence of right-wing media, the right-wing media ecosystem, which emerges in mid-century because conservatives or people on the right wing didn't feel that they had a place within the mainstream discourse, and they did not. They were not given a seat at the table. Neither were leftists, to be clear. What was given a seat at the table at that time was consensus-based, basically everybody nodding their heads in unison. And people on the left and people on the right were really shut out of those conversations. People on the right were just very clever about realizing, okay, well, if the media ecosystem that exists currently won't allow us in, we're going to build our own. And so they did. And a big part of that media apparatus was telling stories, many of which were explicitly religiously tinged, not all of them, but many of them. They were telling stories again and again and again about this amalgamated threat. And if you grow up on those kinds of media and you are habituated into hearing stories about a bunch of things that actually aren't interconnected, but the way the story gets told does connect them and gives them a singular cause, a person coming out of that media ecosystem and overall circumstance, of course they are going to come to this conclusion. Of course the feeling is going to be down into their bones. And if you understand that, and you understand that the belief runs really deep and it's supported from a lot of different directions, you can approach those conversations not necessarily expecting that you're going to convince anybody to change their mind, but understanding what is the conversation actually about. That until you can understand where someone is coming from, how can you expect to make any headway or figure out where might you start to find some common ground to build a conversation rather than immediately going to a place of reactiveness or essentially behaving in a way that the other person will interpret as you being the liberal devil. So it's figuring out where people are coming from and knowing that it's not coming from nowhere. And in fact, it's quite old and very powerful. That is a communication strategy that if you don't have that or you don't understand that, how are you going to move forward? And we have to move forward. We are all here together. And so the question is just how do we do that? I don't I don't have the answers, but I think that calling attention to some of the causes, especially the historical causes, is underappreciated as a place to start.
Thank you so much for writing this book and for coming to talk to us about it.
Oh, of
Um,
course.
where can our listeners learn more about these topics?
Oh, these topics. Well, the book would be a good place to start.
Absolutely. First stop.
Yeah, I one of the places that has a lot of insight, or one of the research areas that tells us a lot about our present moment, is mid-century U.S. media history. That how anti-communism unfolded within a Cold War context. A lot of those histories, it's not that they've not been forgotten by historians, but those histories are not terribly well known, just in an everyday kind of colloquial way. And I think that if more was understood about what anti-communism looked like, how it translated, very often when people think about that background, all they're reflecting on is Birchers or other more extreme articulations of anti-communism. But within anti-communism as a media history, you see all kinds of discourses around parents' rights, around sort of traditional gender roles and the traditional family expectations around that. All of those conversations actually started back then. We have just been having the same conversation over and over and over in moments that in some cases have been punctuated, like the satanic panics of the 70s and 80s. Those are just older anti-communist conversations that have been overlaid with Satan. And then a lot of those conversations 30 years later, 40 years later, have been overlaid with conversations about leftists or Antifa. And so we really can go back to history and understand we are not in a new place. We are actually in an old place, which only calls attention to why it is so important to try to reroute and stop that cycle from continuing to perpetuate itself. So I say go back to history, do some humanities work, and then that will help you better understand where we are in this very complicated moment.
Thank you for that. Well, Whitney Phillips, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me and talking with me.
Whitney Phillips is an associate professor of information politics and media ethics and the John L. Hulteng Endowed Chair in Media Ethics and Responsibility in the School of Journalism and Communication at the University of Oregon. UO Today is a production of the Oregon Humanities Center at the University of Oregon. Thanks for listening.